Welcome back to Boilers Extra. I'm Nathan Baird from the Indianapolis Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
We're going to do things a little bit different today. Purdue, we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. Purdue basketball Tuesday night saw the end of its 7-game losing streak. Its 26-game home. Wait, did I say 7-game losing streak?
Yeah.
7-game winning streak. 26-game home winning streak. Both ended with a loss to Ohio State. Let's just briefly discuss that, but we're going to move on to another topic. You know, before the season, when we went game by game and picked winners and losers, I had picked this game as Purdue's only home loss, just thinking, oh, they're coming off of the long trip out west. Ohio State will be pretty good this year, we think. It just seems like that could be the one that synced up. I didn't want to pick them to go 9-0, so I picked one loss. And going into that game, I thought they would win by 20, or like double digits. And then they're up 16 late in the first half, and things go haywire. And I think it's a reminder that I remember last year when they lost at Columbus, I had a Purdue fan friend of mine when I was still a Columbus resident on one of our text threads was like, oh, they always lose. This is Purdue right on schedule, losing to non-tournament teams. And I'm like, you understand Ohio State just fired its coach for a reason. Like, they were the most underachieving team in the Big Ten and might still be. Chris Holtmann had back-to-back top 10 classes, and this is all they can do with it. Not that Jake Diebler, I think, is doing a good job, and they've been so close. So I think it's just a reminder that you can get pinched at any time. Michigan lost at Minnesota. I don't think people think that the Michigan team that's coming to Mackey Arena on Friday is a pushover. Just a reminder for this team, a reminder for fans, a reminder of all of us who cover this team that it can happen on any night.
Yeah, Jake Diebler now 2-0 against Purdue. So
yeah,
things that people didn't expect to happen. And I remember the question being asked of that game you're referring to a year ago after the game. One of the Columbus beat writers had asked Matt Painter how difficult it was adapting to a coaching change where there was kind of some unexpected. And Matt Painter is never going to put any blame elsewhere except on his own program. And he said, listen, if Chris Holtmann was the coach of this team, we would have lost by a point today. Same thing as what happened. And I think he's right. It's still a lot of the, fingerprints of what Chris Holtmann built and brought in there. Obviously, there's some transfers and some new guys with this team. But I think really, and it looked like it was a blowout early, but when it got to a close game, that was in Ohio State's wheelhouse, who has now played 5 straight one-possession games. And Purdue had been blowing out a lot of opponents, or even the games that it was losing before that. It got blown out at Penn State, got blown out by Auburn. Hadn't really been in these games where you've got to make a play at the very end to win or lose the game. And I think Ohio State probably was more comfortable in that environment. But this is a great thing probably for Purdue in the long run to have played a game like this. This can kind of wake you up a little bit. But I also think that, there's not a need to maybe overreact quite yet just from one loss.
Right. And that's kind of how I wrote about it after the game. I think you wrote something very similar about how, a loss, any team can absorb a loss and still win a Big Ten championship. I think this is maybe the one that you get at home if you still want to win a Big Ten championship. You already lost one on the road to like a lower division team in Penn State. You really can't afford too many more of these. And it makes Friday's game against Michigan all that much more important, because that's a team that you're going to be battling at the top of these standings. But the performance in and of itself, frustrating for sure. But I think there were some things here that were an aberration compared to what we had been seeing for weeks. And Michigan's not always going to hit, or no opponent is going to hit 8 out of 12 threes usually. That got crazy. They were just hitting everything in the second half, and just one of those things where it started rolling downhill. And for the first time in a month, Purdue didn't have an answer for that. We were talking after the game, just in the media room, about how they were down at halftime, both games out west, but they still come back and they're both comfortable wins, relatively comfortable wins. And this time, that momentum, it was a 20-2 run from the first, at the end of the last basket of the first half into the start of the second half. And then the 15-0 run later was the backbreaker. They just couldn't stop the runs.
No. And, I think Purdue had kind of some signs in those recent games that the offense wasn't always going to be there, but defense could be what got you over the hump in some of these games. And then yesterday, the offense, the shots weren't falling, getting the shots maybe you wanted, but Purdue wasn't able to capitalize. And on top of that, the defense just collapses. And both of those things were a recipe for disaster. And, like you said, probably kind of like your one mulligan if you want to have a chance to win the Big Ten title.
I mean, if Ohio State had made 7 of 12 threes, it still would have looked like the defense was just as bad, except that makes up the 3-point difference. And it changes the complexion of everything. So again, trying to give full context to everything. I think you reserve judgment till you see what happens on Friday. We owe you guys a football pod. We have not talked football in a while. We are waiting to talk to. We are in the process of setting up interviews with more interviews with Barry Odom, more interviews or first interviews with the new coaches that are coming in on his staff. So we're kind of holding off on some of that till we get some more direct conversations with those people. Maybe next week would be a good because Purdue is off. Purdue basketball is off in the first half of next week, leading into the Indiana game. So that might be an opportunity for us to go down that road. But for this road, we want to talk about. I like to bring up these sort of like timeless conversations, but then see how they relate to the team that we're covering at the time, and what's the present thing that's going on with whatever team we're talking about. And Purdue basketball is on the verge. Braden Smith, good health assumed, will break the career assists record sometime this season. At his current rate, it's going to be within the next 7-8 games potentially. So before the end of Big Ten season, he should be Purdue's all-time leader in assists. And it just got me thinking, what are the records that nobody's going to break? What are the records that when they're doing Boilers Extra, when it's like our kids are doing Boilers Extra 50 years from now as a tribute to us? God, I hope they figure something better out than to be doing this 50
Technology,
years
fortunately for them, will probably far advance what we're at currently.
Yeah, I think it'll just be telepathic podcasting. They'll just think things and it'll go right into their subscribers' heads. What are the records that will still be standing maybe forever? I think of this in the context of there are baseball records that people thought would stand forever. People thought nobody would break Babe Ruth's home run record, and then Hank Aaron comes along and wipes it off the face of the earth, and then Barry Bonds comes along and overtakes that. So there are records that just seem big, and then there's records that the game has changed so much. Cy Young won 511 games.
Right.
It's tough to get to 150 anymore because you only pitch 5 innings a game or whatever. So I'm thinking of it in terms like that. What are the ones that just look like either the game has changed or that performance was so singularly dominant by that athlete that it's never going to change? As you were looking back through Purdue history in preparation for this, Sam, was there anything that jumped out to you? It gave me new perspective on how hard it is to be an all-time leader in something at Purdue. And especially if the people who have a gap between 1 and 2 in any category, it's all just all-time great players. And often just singular players for their generation almost that are able to separate from that. And it's just, that maybe sounds like an obvious thing, but sometimes until you sit down and look at it in black and white, you forget just how stark the contrast is between an all-time great player and a great player.
Yeah. And when I was looking over a lot of these, I was kind of well aware of because of the Zach Edey impact the last couple of years, where you're constantly tracking some records just because some records are going to fall. Same with, I had talked to Bruce Parkinson multiple times last season about Braden Smith, and he was like, hey, my assist record is going to go, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. But, I'm happy for him whenever that happens. But
that'd be something for us to cover. Bruce Parkinson does some sort of Nancy Kerrigan sabotage on.
He's a friend of the family, he's part of the reason that Braden Smith ended up at Purdue. So I think he's going to be okay with this. But then, you look back at what some of the players did in the 60s and early 70s, the Terry Dishingers and Rick Mounts. Those are the marks that just seem unbreakable beyond means. And probably even, for the sake of this podcast, I'm probably not even going to really go into those because, I don't know what you've got on your list here, but those are just kind of the obvious. Some of those records are never going to be touched.
We didn't share lists. I imagine we're going to sync up pretty well because there's some that really just jump off the page at you. One that I'm going to take off the board immediately, but let's go ahead and talk about it. An obvious one isn't set yet, but assuming Braden Smith, again, plays every game he can play for Purdue, not just this year, but next year. Does anybody ever break that assist record? Whatever that number ends up being,
Right.
that's going to set just such a new standard. And actually, to think of how much farther he's going to be able to pull away from number 2 on this list is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and so last year when it became obvious that Braden Smith was a guy that was going to go into that upper echelon of Purdue point guards, and I had talked to a ton of point guards from the past, and just the way that assists are tracked now. I remember Brian Walker, who I think he was at second until Braden Smith passed him this year in career assist. He said, listen, to get an assist back then, we held the ball. There was no shot clock. We held the ball, and I would dribble to one side, pass to Joe Barry Carroll. If the shot wasn't there, he'd kick it back out. I'd dribble to the other side and throw it back into him. The game has changed completely, and especially with these motion offenses. I've started tracking every player that caught a Braden Smith assist, and I want to kind of break down as this record comes to be what percentage of those went to each player. And obviously Zach Edey has a lot of those, but I think people are going to be surprised by how many also went to other players and how much variety there is on that list. It's pretty impressive. So I don't think this assist record is probably going to be broken in our lifetime, whatever it ends up being. And it could end up being 1,000 assists, maybe even.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's on that sort of trajectory. And it does make me think, though, is it that this record he's doing something so impressive that it's going to just lap the field for another generation? Or does this say something about what a Purdue point guard has been in the more modern era, that they haven't had a guy with the combination of longevity and talent that Braden Smith has? And that was something that kept coming up when I was looking at numbers, because I would sometimes see a record and be like, oh, wow, that's really impressive. Like, that would be really tough to beat. But then I would stop and break it down and be like, well, all that really means is that guy needs to play for 4 years. There's records that people who only played 2 or 3 years hold, and you think, my God, what would they have done if they'd been able to play 4 years? So it would probably be a long time before it is broken. That's the really hard combination, is someone who is supremely talented, comes in and plays right away, and then stays all 4 years. And when I say supremely talented, that separates you from guys who have been 4-year starters. Purdue's had some very good 4-year starters who go on and play long professional basketball careers, not necessarily NBA, but are in professional basketball for quite a while. And we're talking about players who are a step above that.
Yeah. Man, I think it's when you think back to how Braden Smith started, and a couple years ago, people were concerned about him getting the ball across midcourt when teams pressed. And now that seems like almost Purdue wants to welcome you to come and press, because they're going to break that press easily and get a quick 2 points out of it. And a lot of times, he's done a tremendous job kind of knowing where people are. I think, Matt Painter used the phrase a couple games ago, because he is a scorer. He's got a scorer mindset, but he is a pass first thinker. And he'll pass up, sometimes shots that he should take to get somebody a better shot. And I think that's just kind of ingrained in his DNA, and probably why he's been able to, especially over these last 2 years, rack up these assist totals the way that he has.
I think it's a great thing to bring up, because one of the truly intriguing things about Braden Smith is, even though he's a 3-year starter and is about to set this record again, we used to call, in my old podcast, we would say we didn't even want to speak into the concept of injuries. We didn't want to put that bad juju out there. So we would always say, we refer to them as alien abduction. So as long as he doesn't get abducted by aliens, so we'll say that about Braden Smith, as long as he doesn't get abducted by aliens. But he is in sort of a transitional year, almost, you could say, for his career, right? Like, he never had to be this kind of a high volume shooter and scorer in the past. And that was clearly going to be, he was somewhat, but not to this extent. And that was going to be a new thing for him to take on this season. And he is still, I think, getting even halfway through this season, you can still see him like getting comfortable with that. It kind of comes and goes in my view. And I'm intrigued by what that's going to look like in March. I'm intrigued by what that's going to look like when next season starts.
Yeah. And if you think back to the Creighton exhibition game, and Braden Smith was just hitting everything, he was taking a lot of shots. It was reason to think this is what Purdue is now. He's going to have to be the go-to scorer. He's going to have to take a lot of shots. And there's been games where he's taken, 5-6 field goal attempts. Then last night he had 14. He's really going to take what the defense gives him. And if you're giving them that short pick and roll, or you're leaving shooters open in the corner, he's going to make, more often than not, the right decision for Purdue to have a chance to score. And I think that's really kind of the unique trait about him more than anything, because everybody wants to score, and the people that get a lot of the publicity are guys who score 18, 20 points a game. And he's capable of doing that. But even dating back to high school, he's always been a guy who, has hung his hat on setting up others. And because of that, he's starting to get this recognition. You hear it almost every game you watch on TV, or if you watch the BTN post-game shows or pre-game shows or whatever. He's definitely being put in a conversation with guys like Cassius Winston, Magic Johnson, the all-time great point guards in Big Ten history, just based off of what he does, not only as a scorer, but as a passer, also as a rebounder, and just a guy who, really is the most valuable player of this team, because he's got to set the offense up every single play.
When you've done things in your career to put yourself in the same conversation as Magic Johnson, that's pretty crazy. And again, he's got another year to go. But enough about that one. That's not on our lists, but I thought that was worth mentioning. Sam, what's the first one on your list of unbreakable records in Purdue basketball?
For the sake of kind of what we were just on, also a record that's probably going to be broken that we didn't mention, Matt Painter at some point is going to pass Gene Katie's career wins total. So I did not include that, because that's, a year or two away, right? But also inevitable. Yeah. And there's a lot, and I tried not to go into ones that were obvious. So the first one I put on my list was Glenn Robinson scoring 1,030 points in the 93-94 season, because that's, to do that, we celebrate Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith scoring 1,000 career points. It took them 2.5 years. And Glenn Robinson did it in 34 games in 93-94. And if it was ever going to happen, it was going to be last year. Zach Edey averaged 25 plus over 39 games and still was 47 points short of even tying that. So I think, unless the game expands to having 50-game college seasons, I don't see anybody coming in and joining the 1,000-point club in one season.
Yeah, that was on my short list. I didn't want to have too many scoring-related things. I went with something else scoring-related, but you said it best. Zach Edey was built in a factory to break this record. Almost like you had a guy who was incredibly efficient, was semi-unguardable, was going to draw a ton of fouls and shoot a good percentage, and was going to be here all 4 years. Just a dominant player who would be here all 4 years, as opposed to Big Dog, who only played 2 years because he didn't play as a freshman, and then he was gone 2 years later. So that who else would have broken that if not for him? And it put in perspective just how insanely great that kind of season is. And I guess it's the other reason I didn't pick it, though. Well, there's two reasons. Number one, it's not unfathomable that someday in Purdue history, they'll get a player as transcendently good as Glenn Robinson, who also can shoot 3-pointers. And that would put a record like that more in reach. Also, I don't think they're going to play 50-game seasons, but the greedy TV channels are out there talking about having a 96-game NCAA tournament. And if somebody were to play all the way to the end of that, because that was the other thing. That's the other way Zach Edey's last season should have got. He played all the way down to the last game you could possibly play, and it still wasn't enough to get him all the way there as dominant of a scorer as he was. So that was why I backed off of that one. I went in a different direction with my scoring one, and I was having trouble picking between two of them. I'm going to go with one that is maybe a little bit more nuanced. It's Rick Mount having 46 30-point games in his career. I don't know if anybody's going to get halfway there. In fact, Zach Edey, again, brilliant scorer, played all 4 seasons. You know how many 30-point games he had in his career?
Probably 6, maybe.
No, 19. He had 19
wow.
30-point games. But again, not even halfway to what Rick Mount did without the 3-point line. It's insane. Dave Shellhouse, who is second on the list with 33. So, like, it's still like a third more and above that Rick Mount had in his career. Just, I don't think that we're ever going to see someone shoot, number one, with that volume. Like, if you go back, one of the unbreakable records is like how many times Rick Mount took like 40 some shots in a game.
Right.
Like that offense was get Rick Mount the ball and let him shoot. If you thought people like Carson Edwards were high volume shooters in Purdue history, now I never saw Rick Mount play. Obviously, I was born in '78. You never saw Rick Mount play on a daily basis. You're even younger than me, but like, you don't have to, like, you can envision what that was like watching him with good reason put up shot after shot after shot. And the other reason why it won't happen is if they have someone who does score enough that is a guard, I doubt they're staying 4 years, right? Like, are you going to get a guard that plays? And I guess Mount only did 3 years, but could someone really do that in 3 years with the volume that individual players shoot anymore? I'm highly suspect. That is just those numbers really stand out. Like, if you say, hey, do you know Dave Shellhouse had 33 career 30-point games? You're like, wow, that's a lot. And then someone says, well, but Rick Mount had 46. It puts in perspective. Like, Rick Mount had almost as much as Shellhouse and Edey put together.
Yeah, I think at one point Mount had like 11 straight or something crazy like that. And obviously, people remember the 61-point game he had against Iowa. At least the older people. I remember our former colleague Jeff Washburn watching that game on YouTube, which the guy wasn't technologically savvy. So how he got to that game film on YouTube probably is its own mystery. But he was watching it and he said, if they had a 3-point line back then, he would have had 70 whatever points it was. And that's, you have to kind of draw an imaginary 3-point line on there. But it wasn't like Rick Mount was getting a bunch of shots at the rim. He was a jump shooter who, like you said, took a ton of shots and averaged something like 35 points a game, which is just ridiculous in itself. But yeah, there's a lot of Rick Mount scoring records you could go to. And I think that's a good one to not just say, hey, nobody's ever going to score 61 again. Obviously, that's still a Big Ten record. That's probably never going to be broken. When you think back, I think in the last 30 years, only Zach Edey and Carson Edwards have even scored 40 in a game. So
right.
To say 46 30-point games, I don't see anybody that, really is going to come close to that. And I think if you look at the entire roster as it's currently constructed, Braden Smith is the only player who even has a 30-point game, which was earlier this season when he had 34 against whoever it was right out of Christmas break.
Yeah, I had the 61-point game on my short list also. I went with the other one, the 30-point games, because you can flukishly have one insanely huge game and just blow up, and that's an extreme example of that, right? And it probably won't ever happen. Like you were saying, like when guys get into the 30s now, or someone crosses 40, that's seen as like a huge game, let alone getting all the way to 61. So that is probably never happening. But the ones that require prolific excellence, like repeated excellence, almost like nightly excellence, those are the ones, kind of like with Glenn Robinson's scoring record, that I gravitated to for a list like this. What else is on your list?
Man, I don't want to go overloaded heavy on scoring. So, I've got more than 3 here. Kind of to your point of what you said about the sustained excellence, Zach Edey's 69 career double-doubles are something I don't think ever gets broken, because somebody who's capable of doing that, I think back to Caleb Swanigan, for example, typically aren't 4-year players. And what Zach Edey had to his advantage was he played 4 years and really could have come back for a 5th year with the COVID year. But that's pretty impressive. He had 30 last season alone. And Caleb Swanigan ended up with 36, and he left after a sophomore year, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So I think anybody who's capable of having that consistent, and it's obviously, I think points and rebounds are the easiest or most, I guess, accomplishable way to get a double-double, seemingly. To get 69 in a career seems like a tough task. Terry Dischinger is second on the list, and kind of like you said, with that major gap separation, is 15 behind that, and he had like 12 in a row at one point. So I just don't see anybody who can come in there and consistently give you the 10 points, 10 rebounds, or, in the case of a Braden Smith, 10 points, 10 assists, that many times over 4 seasons.
I have some other things that are sort of related to this, but Zach Edey records, I think, are going to stand for a long, long, long time. And at first glance, you might think, well, but Purdue always has good big men, and it's just a matter of, the next one that stays 4 years, maybe he's got a little bit of something different in his game, and that lets him do something that Zach Edey couldn't do. But watching him from afar, I would just kind of chuckle, because it was like Matt Painter had been triangulating the ideal big man for this offense for 20 years. And then he finally hit him. He found him in Canada, of all places, but he finally hits him, like the one who is so skilled and so big. But because of the modern way that people look at basketball players, was probably going to, and because of NIL, was going to have incentive to stay for that 4th year. And I think these records probably will stand the test of time, because when you're talking about career records, that's a big part of it, is just the longevity of it. I'm going to throw another Zach Edey one in here. And it's very much along the same lines. So there's 2 players in Purdue history with 2,000 points and 1,000 rebounds. It's Edey and Joe Barry Carroll. But Edey has over 2,500 points, and he has over 1,250 rebounds. Joe Barry Carroll is not that close to either of those numbers. I don't know that there's ever going to be another 2,500, 1,250 player in Purdue history, because, again, you have to have 4 years. That first year, you still have to be a useful player who's getting on the court and doing something. You can't have a whole year where you aren't really accumulating towards these numbers. And to do both of those things, to be that excellent of a scorer, that excellent of a rebounder, and to do it with that longevity is rare. Obviously, the fact that only one Purdue player has ever done it, few players in college history have ever done it. Again, because not most great players don't stay for 4 years. So that's the other thing to remember always with the Zach Edey stuff, was that he was the right guy at the right time, not just the right time for Purdue with some of the players around him, but the right time in college basketball history. If he'd come along 30 years earlier, maybe he doesn't make it to year 3, because the NBA looked at big men differently. But also, if he comes along 2 years earlier, NIL's not there in any way. And I know that he was a little bit limited being an international student, but it isn't there for him in any way to help offset what you lose by not going into pro ball that after that 3rd year. So it was a great marriage of timing for the right coach, the right player, the right program, and it blossomed into what all of you got to experience for the last 4 years.
Yeah, and something that gets overlooked now because it seems like it's in the far distance was, and something that Zach had talked about quite a bit, was he had a great mentor, not only in Brandon Brantley, which, who put in tons of hours behind the scenes to get Zach Edey there. Also had Matt Painter's patient approach, because he's talked numerous times about Matt Painter would say, I don't care if he can't catch the ball, referencing Zach Edey as a freshman, keep throwing it to him. And you had to absorb a lot of those turnovers and mistakes as a freshman, knowing the potential in the long run. But also having Travion Williams early in his career, who really mentored him, showed him the ropes, made him a lot better passing big man, but also a rebounder and a scorer. Just having that to go against every day, that to lean on when you had questions, really helped him mature in those younger years, so that when Travion was gone, Zach Edey was ready to elevate and become a 2-time national player of the year, and do things that put his, records, being the school's all-time rebounding leader, the school's all-time leading scorer, in territory that, probably won't be reached anytime soon, if ever.
Yeah, I was here for Trevion's first couple of seasons, my previous life covering this team, and always thought of him as like a really, he'd had some rough things early in his life, had to overcome some things, but a smart guy. And I appreciated just sort of the perspective and the way that he saw the world. And it doesn't surprise me at all to then hear after I left that he would take someone under his wing. Well, you can't really take Zach Edey under your wing because you can't reach that high, even
Big
him.
wing.
But right. Yeah, it was like a pterodactyl could take him under his wing. That's about it. That you hear later that he had such a sort of formidable experience on helping him have the career that he had. And it's funny how, that's part of a player's legacy often is what are you passing on? I've talked to players from the high school level on up about that before, that like what that team does next year in part reflects on what you were as a player, how you left it, what you were as a leader, what you were as a teammate. And that's one of the best examples in recent, maybe or all of Purdue history of a guy stepping up and helping out a younger guy. What's the third one on your list?
We kind of talked about this beforehand, and it's something that initially I thought that's a record in my mind I thought was possibly going to be broken, was Carson Edwards' career number of three-pointers, which is 281. As you mentioned, a high-volume shooter. He's also got the most attempts in program history. But I was like, well, surely Fletcher Loyer has got to be on pace to at least have a chance to break that record, right? And then I look, and Fletcher Loyer needs 121 threes in a year and a half, which without, far surpassing his current rate, isn't going to come close. So,
right.
Especially with the game now, teams rely on the three-pointer much more than ever. I think that looking at one guy to get 281, because Carson Edwards was just a gunner. And I think once he got across midcourt, and you saw that 2019 tournament run, which is the most insane single individual performance over a stretch of games I think I've ever seen, Zach Edey included. He was in range as soon as he crossed midcourt, and he just got in a zone where he piled up a ton of threes right there at the very end of his Purdue career. And he did it in 3 seasons, which is what's really impressive when you think of Fletcher Loyer being a really good 3-point shooter and going to be a 4-year starter, start every game of his career, and probably not even going to contend to break that record.
The other thing about someone like Edwards was, and when you start talking about the fine points of some of these records, and the number that he amassed, it went beyond this, but like, is your team winning every year? Is your team playing a couple extra games because of the Big Ten tournament? Is your team winning in the NCAA tournament? Do you end your career with like 10 or 12 more games than a player with a similar career who didn't have that kind of team success? Those things get reflected in these numbers sometimes. And obviously that 2018-19 season, he had a big say in how couple extra games that they played. But it's another example of right place, right time also, because there were a lot of guys on that team that could shoot a high percentage from 3-point range. Like even someone like Grady Eifert shot a pretty good percentage from 3-point range, but a low volume guy. Like he was going to pick his spots. Ryan Klein was a higher volume guy, but nobody was a higher volume guy than Carson. And Carson was either there wasn't a lot of intermediate. There was some, but it seemed like he was attacking the basket or he's shooting 3, and he would just pull up in transition and shoot it sometimes, because that was what especially that last year, that's what he had been tasked with doing. It's if Braden Smith wasn't worried about assists, that's kind of what it looked like. It was somebody going down and putting up a lot of shots. And if he had shot even a higher percentage that last year, he would have really put a number like that out of reach. And then Fletcher Loyer is such a talented 3-point shooter, and a guy that on any given night, you could see him blow up and hit several. But think of how much of his game happens inside the arc, like getting to the basket, or the more intermediate stuff that he does, trying to draw fouls, the leaners and things. Like it's a big part of his game. It's almost what he hunts for in some ways. The threes will come to him in the offense, or they will, run sets to get him open for threes. But what he hunts, it feels like when you watch him, is a lot of that intermediate stuff, trying to draw contact, trying to get himself an and one, get to the free throw line, put pressure on the other defense. And he's such a smart player, just a savvy player. And so Yes, I think that's a really good one to point out. We had talked about that before we got on as an example of, your first thought when you sit down is like, well, let's go see how close Fletcher Lawyer is to this, because maybe no, it's just not going to happen, because there's not some fault of his. It's just that's not his game doesn't take that much predominance toward the three the way it does other players.
Right. Yeah, and he's a guy who's, over the course of 3 years, you can count on him for 8 to 20 points most nights. Sometimes he pops off and goes for 25, 27, whatever it is. But like you said, his right-handed runner that he does the floater over the defense so often is almost automatic. And even last night, he had a wide open three where he pumped fake. The guy goes flailing out of bounds, trying to block it. And then he takes one step inside the 3-point line and hits a 2-pointer. Probably could have been a 3, but it was just kind of that instant savviness that you talk about where he, okay, well, now he's out of the way. I've got a closer shot. I can take a dribble or two and get a closer range shot and put that in. I just don't think he's going to be the kind of volume shooter that you talk about, even to a Ryan Klein degree, definitely not to a Carson Edwards degree, because he is so relying on the sets, and he's relying on Braden Smith kind of having that telepathy to kind of know where he is. Those two seem to be really in sync more than anybody that I can remember as teammates, and it's probably because of how many games they've played together in that backcourt. But he's never going to be a guy that shoots 10 threes in a game, for example. He might be a guy that, like you said, can go 6 for 9 one game, 6 for 10 one game, but it's not going to be a consistent thing where he's taking a lot of shots. And if he does, it's going to be probably a mix of 2s and 3s.
Yeah, although the reason I didn't put it on my list is I could see Purdue getting that player again someday, getting someone like Carson Edwards. Like, again, what if they just get Carson Edwards again, but he shoots better that last year? Because people don't remember, as awesome as he was in that NCAA tournament, he didn't have a great third year. It didn't, from a shooting perspective, it was not the percentage he would have wanted that season. So if he just shoots a few percent points higher and the rest of his career is the same, he'd have even more. So that was why I didn't put it on my list. But I think it also just, the Fletcher Lawyer career puts in perspective, because he is going to probably play that fourth year. And even with that fourth year, won't get what Carson Edwards did in 2 years as a starter and 1 year as kind of a part-time starter guy coming off the bench.
Yeah, Matt Painter, maybe it was 2 years ago, but it was kind of became a consistent reminder to the media when we spoke to him, because people now remember this differently. They think Carson Edwards just like lit up everybody as a junior, and he's like, no, he was shooting pretty poorly going into the NCAA tournament, and then he just absolutely caught fire unlike anything we've ever seen. But he's like, that's why you stick with it. And I think it was a couple years ago, because Fletcher Lawyer had gone through a stretch where he missed a bunch of threes, and he kept saying, he's going to make a bunch in a row coming up here. And he kept referencing that, like, when you have a guy who can shoot like that, you just let them shoot through the funk, because ultimately you get what you got out of Carson Edwards in the NCAA tournament, letting them do that. So I do think people kind of remember Carson Edwards differently because of just how his time at Purdue ended. But I don't see, at least not in the short term, anybody who's going to be given kind of that freedom to do what Carson Edwards did, where it's like, hey, shoot 25 shots a game, because that's our best bet to win this game offensively.
I think Fletcher Lawyer should go get with a local, like, plumbing company, because that's the commercial, right? Like, how do you clean out this drain? Same way I get out of a slump. You shoot through the funk. I'll take 1% of that. I'll take 1%.
He made some NIL money off of his last name. Just do you need a lawyer? I think it was. You better Fletcher or something like that a couple years ago. So that was pretty creative. So, and I think Purdue's got a pretty good marketing team in terms of the NIL stuff. So always intrigued to see kind of the creativity that those people come up with. But maybe you should pitch the plumbing thing and ask for, portion of the proceeds or whatever contract goes 1%. With that.
I'm not greedy. 1%. 1% is all I ask. It's like a finder's fee. All right, my last one, and I was trying to. I ended up seeing some rebounding things. I know we've already talked about scoring and rebounding, but Terry Dishinger's rebounding in his career, the thing that was really stark contrast to me was, and I know that Caleb Swanigan only did 2 seasons, but Caleb Swanigan is like the most perfect rebounding machine I've ever seen. And because he wasn't Zach Edey, he wasn't 7'4" and the largest mountain of a person that's ever been on the earth. He had to work for it in a different way. And it was a lot about, yes, technique, and he put in a lot of physical time, and he wasn't a small guy, but a lot of it was just attitude. There's like one of the all-time great quotes I ever had was asking him about rebounding and saying something to him about how, how he's basically ripping the ball out of teammates' hands to get rebounds. And he just kind of looked at me and he said, "There's no teammates in rebounding." I was like, "Oh, okay." Like, that's how it is. Like, that's how you get double doubles on the reg. And I have thought at times that Purdue needed more of that sort of, what's the right word? I mean, there's right words I could say, but I don't want to say them on the air and not to disparage him, because that was who Caleb Swanigan was on the court. He's just kind of nasty in the right way on the court. And I think that's a thing that your program needs. I don't know if Terry Dischinger was a nasty guy on the court, but I know that he did nasty things from a rebounding perspective. So I thought about the 13.7 rebounds per game that he had in 60, 61 or 61, 62. I can't remember. That might have been his career. Actually, it was. I think that was his career rebounding. 13.7, which is crazy, but I think also is reflective of the times a little bit. You saw bigger rebounding numbers back then because shooters, the game wasn't as built on maximum efficiency as it is now. But the thing that did jump out to me was 9 20 rebound games. Is that going to last the test of time again? Because you have to get the combination of that kind of talent and then have them stick around for 4 years. Because double-digit rebounds is one thing. Getting all the way to 20 rebounds on a regular basis is quite another. And even the ones that the great rebounders that Purdue's had in recent vintage, Zach Edey, Caleb Swanigan, I think maybe they both had 4 in their career. I'd have to look that up again. I think like combined they had less than Dischinger did. And it's one of those things that is maybe it's kind of just a bygone era that a guy would be that prolific with the rebounds. But I think it also speaks to, again, how elusive it is to find someone who is supremely talented and is incentivized to stay at Purdue for 4 years.
Yeah, and this kind of reminds me of last year. We were outside of Purdue's locker room after a practice or before a practice, waiting to interview certain players or waiting for Matt Painter to come out of the elevator or whatever it might have been. And there was an old game on, maybe it was on BTN from the early 80s. And the media members who were there, and then Chris Foreman, the sports information director for Purdue basketball, we were all kind of sitting there laughing at the style of play because you had basically 8 guys in the paint, and then you had a guy dribbling out there and a defender on him. And we're like, look at this game. Like, everybody's so packed in one little area, and then a shot goes up, and then the tallest guy gets the rebound. And, we laugh about it now because we've seen the game obviously evolve from that. But that is how basketball used to be, where there wasn't this high volume of three-pointers. And I see stats all the time on social media of so-and-so has more career three-pointers than Larry Bird. And when Larry Bird played,
Larry Bird played for 2 years in a very different era.
That wasn't a part of the game as much. So, and now it's very much a part of the game. Rebounding to some degree is probably easier now, but it's also easier for 8 or 9 different players on the court versus, a bunch of guys boxed in together. And usually the guy who can jump the highest or is the tallest is going to get that rebound and go the other way. So I think that record is probably unbreakable just because of the evolution of basketball more than anything.
Yeah. And I think that, I'd have to go back and look at like what those teams' shooting percentages were, but like, did he play in an era where there were just a lot more offensive rebounds to be had? Because Purdue, in a way that he plays now, is such an efficient offense year in and year out that you don't typically have an abundance of opportunities for offensive rebounds if you're Purdue. So those things kind of play into those. But again, it's the abundance of being able to do it that frequently. It's a fun record to have on the books, I think, though. Because, and by the way, these records don't really go back much before like the 50s. I don't think teams really trust what scattered numbers there are that existed before that. Purdue's record book, when you look at it, it really kind of starts around 1950. But to have a number like that out there, these are the kind of numbers that I'm sure Caleb Swanigan, maybe he didn't actually look at it on paper and see this, but like players like that would come in and say, well, that's the kind of player I want to be. I want to be dominant in that way. So to get to that record by the end of my career would really mean something. And when they're that far off in the distance, that gives you something to shoot for. And I'm sure that, when Braden Smith came in as a freshman, did he think I'm going to be the all-time leader in assists at Purdue by the end of my third year, or certainly before the end of my career? I don't know if he was thinking that, but just knowing how much I know about him now from the past 7 months, it feels like he would have that drive in him, that he would have already been thinking, with the chip that he has on his shoulder and kind of wanting to prove himself and help his team win and be a facilitator. The maximum version of doing that would be to get more assists than any Purdue player has ever had. So these things can be sort of a driving force. The history isn't just for us to talk about and fans to talk about on Twitter, like you're saying. Like it can also be a motivational tool for these players.
Yeah, and Braden Smith is very much, I don't want to compare him to Michael Jordan in terms of basketball talent, but people who watched the Last Dance during COVID and all that stuff and kind of laugh now that everything Michael Jordan saw that was negative, he would put that, kind of in his bag and was like, oh, okay, you think Karl Malone's better than me? I'm going to go out and score 50 points when we play the Jazz. Braden Smith very much has that, like, having talked to him in the past and maybe not so much publicly, but you ask him about, hey, did you see that so-and-so said this about you on Twitter or on their blog or whatever? And he'll be like, well, they don't know what they're talking about. And he keeps that internally and is like, I'm going to go, show them when I get a chance to play them, whatever it might be. One example might be, Indiana fans who thought Xavier Johnson was a far more talented player than Braden Smith. And then last year, Braden Smith, had his way with Indiana, not so much 2 years ago, but definitely last year. I think he very much does keep that stuff close to the vest and kind of feels like he always has a point to prove for whatever reason, even though now a lot of people are giving him his deserved flowers and saying one of the Big Ten's all-time great point guards, clearly one of the best players in Purdue basketball history. He still views it as like, I've always been doubted, or people don't think I'm capable of this, even though you've already kind of proven that's not true anymore. And probably why he's such a great player. I think that he's, when you talk about guys who are nasty, he sometimes seems like a guy who plays nasty. He attacks rebounding kind of the way you're talking about Caleb Swanigan. Now he's 5'11", and he's not going to get all those boards, but he's a guy who is always crashing into the glass and he's jumping up and taking rebounds away from teammates. And he's not going to end up with 10, 12 rebounds, but you might get 2 extra that you wouldn't have otherwise. And that's probably what sparked this whole conversation about records, is because Braden Smith and the way he plays has put himself in line to be the next, Purdue record breaker.
Yeah, we're getting close to really getting into jinx territory, but I guess we should go ahead and do it because we've already sort of jinxed that he's going to get the record, but it does seem inevitable at this point, all things being, going as planned. He was also, when you're preseason player of the year, that it'll either happen because you were what Zach Edey was, you were already the player of the year and you're back. Excuse me. So you should be the player of the year the next year, going into the next year, or you get it because you're a really good player, but there isn't necessarily an obvious choice. You're the best player on the preseason picked as the best team. A lot of things just lined up to make him the guy that people went with. And I wasn't sure if that was going to be a blessing or a curse for him this year, because I talked to him at Big Ten Media Day and other places about, the same things you're talking about, that, still trying to prove people wrong, still trying to, show the doubters they were wrong, all those sorts of things. And here he is, like, he's followed up on it. Like, to go back to Carson Edwards, going into that 2018-19 season, he was the Big Ten preseason player of the year. And I remember writing then that, like, okay, that's the easy part. Like, getting voted preseason player of the year is the easy part. Actually going out and being the postseason player of the year is really hard. it's based on actual accomplishment, number one. Number two, there's a lot of things out of your control that go along with it. But right now, as we sit here on January 22nd, I think Braden Smith is in a really good position to end up winning that award this year.
Yeah, and there's a lot of banter about this stuff. And when I vote for these awards, I don't know how you view them. Listen, there are players in the Big Ten who are better NBA prospects, probably guys who are going to have better pro careers than Braden Smith. When I vote for these things, I look at what they do as a college player and how they impact their team, lead their team to success. Obviously, the 2 years that I voted for Big Ten Player of the Year, it was an obvious choice that nobody had to really think in depth about. That's not the case as much this year, but I think for that is why Braden Smith is in this conversation, because Purdue is not in a position to be a Big Ten champion without what Braden Smith has been able to do. Now, you can take a certain player off of one team or another at Michigan State or, even maybe Michigan or Illinois. And I think that those teams are still pretty good and maybe in position to win a league title. And now Trey Kaufman-Renn, Fletcher Lawyer, they've had big parts of this too. But I think Braden Smith is probably more important to his team than anybody else in the league.
Braden Smith is number one on the KenPom Big Ten Conference ranking. Trey Kaufman-Renn is number two. Do you know who numbers 3 and 4 are?
Boy.
You're going to see him Friday night. It's Danny Wolf and Vladislav Golden from Michigan. So the top 4 players as of Wednesday afternoon on the KenPom Big Ten rankings are going to be in Mackey Arena on Friday night. It's the first of 2 meetings between these teams this season. And Michigan was undefeated in the Big Ten through several games and then gets tripped up at the buzzer at Minnesota last week in kind of a stunner. I post these power rankings every Thursday afternoon because that's when they're due. I should try to get him in earlier so they'll at least have a little bit more shelf life. But I had Michigan number 1 and Minnesota number 18 and was writing this little blurb about how Michigan was taking care of business on the road. And then within 3 hours, I'm getting a text from my boss, Nat Newell. It's like, well, I'm glad I put those up when I did, because they would have at least got 3 hours of not looking like a complete idiot. So we'll see how stupid I can look when I post those this week. But Michigan is legit. Purdue is obviously legit. These are 2 teams that want to have a say in the outcome of this league. But I think there is some, I don't know if the pressure is the right word, but there's a lot to be gained for either of these teams. Michigan can gain a lot by coming to Purdue and winning, and same for Purdue. It buys you a little bit of wiggle room for when you go up to Ann Arbor. It doesn't put the pressure on you to equalize that win there. So 8:00 Friday night, I think it's going to be a pretty good game.
Yeah, absolutely. And even more so now, this game is kind of maximized based on what did happen against Ohio State. So, I almost wrote it and then I got behind and didn't do it. And now I'm kind of glad to your point that I didn't post this and look dumb in retrospect, but I was almost like, man, Purdue got through that Pacific Northwest trip with 2 wins. And now you get 3 games at home that you should win and really have this massive winning streak when your schedule ramps up here with, some tough road games down the stretch run here. And then sure enough, Purdue stubs its toe. And every year in the Big Ten, these teams stub their toe. Michigan State isn't going to run through the league unbeaten. Its schedule is ridiculously tough here in the latter stages of league play. So this thing still very much is up in the air, but also why these games like Friday night, like the following Friday when Purdue plays Indiana, and then, you talk about going to Ann Arbor, going to East Lansing later on, going to Champaign. A lot of big games still on the schedule for the contenders in this league.
Yeah, I all along thought that Tuesday game was the real end of the West Coast trip in some ways. That's why I said that before the season with that game. And I even asked after the game, I think people can go back and see the videos. Was it Trey Kaufman-Renn that I asked after the game in Oregon? I said, I kind of brought up that thought, like, hey, does that really seem like this trip isn't over until you guys come back and answer on Tuesday? He's like, oh yeah, that's definitely what this is. And for half of the game, it looked like they were on their way, and it did not turn out that way. So what do you think what is Purdue going to do against a team with 2 7-footers now that it is a team? And this is where it seems like getting Caleb First into this starting lineup and getting production out of him and having him start to play regularly like a starter, as opposed to just being a starter, That seems massive for this game, because I think it would have been obviously if they stayed with small ball, they're trying to use that matchup to their advantage against a team of 2 7-footers. But for a team that has rebounding issues and doesn't have any rim protection, I feel like this is a big test.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going to go. If this became sort of a situation where Caleb Furst had been playing sparingly up to this point, and now it's like, okay, well, we've got a matchup with 2 7-footers, so we're going to put Caleb Furst in to offset their size a little bit and give us some more defensive versatility with some big men. You're probably asking a lot out of somebody, but now that he's gained confidence and played well for a majority of this time since he's been starting, I think it's probably a little bit easier to navigate this situation. I don't know this for certain because I probably should ask Matt Painter this. If Cam Heide and Miles Colvin had given Purdue more of an offensive boost consistently when they were starting, would this lineup change have happened? Or do you stick with the small ball? But I think that, Caleb Furst doing what he did against Toledo, and the fact that their offensive output had been so sparse, I guess, or not consistent enough, it made it kind of an easy decision to say, hey, let's go for defense with CJ Cox and Caleb Furst. And we know out of the other 3 guys, we're going to get our offense. And then whatever we get beyond that is just kind of adding on to it. So I think it's going to be, obviously what Purdue's had a lot of success with is doing a lot of help, doing a lot of switching, but also Caleb Furst offsetting kind of one of these big guys who are capable of taking you out on the perimeter and things like that.
I think it was a kind of a perfect storm with Furst, because he had that Toledo game where he, I believe, maybe led them in box plus minus without playing starters minutes in that game. Mm-hmm. And that in combination with Painter just really wanted him for that matchup on Darson Garcia. And then that paid off. And you started to just finally see some momentum, like tangible momentum at that position for the first time all season. I shouldn't even say that position, because it's really just the 5th spot in the lineup, whatever you want to call it, but somebody next to Trey Kaufman-Renn. And I think they were just going to roll with the hot hand a little bit until they found the thing that stuck. And it really felt like it was sticking. And he had a really good first half, actually, I thought, last night. One of those games where you look up at halftime and he isn't taking a lot of shots and doesn't even have a ton of rebounds, but he's right there with the plus minus leaders. And then, like everybody else, he had a bad plus minus for the second half. So It didn't last, but so he wasn't, I don't know if he was part of the problem, but he wasn't part of the solution. So, but everybody, I think, on that team is wanting to have a better game for Friday, and it is a big one. So for Sam King, I'm Nathan Baird. We will both be at Mackey Arena Friday night. Follow us, our reporting at IndyStar.com, JCOnline.com. Follow us on Twitter. Find us wherever you can find podcasts. We'll talk to you later.